Hi, it's good to be with you again.
Good to be here.
Let's talk a little bit about your experience of coming out. Specifically, I know for you, like for many people, there were a lot of elements to it. There was family elements, there was elements with friends, and most intriguingly, there's internal elements, just your kind of conversation with yourself in a sense. So maybe you can frame it with me in terms of when you developed a kind of consciousness about identity for yourself.
Sure, so let's start a little bit with some of my background.
Yes.
Born and raised in Teaneck, New Jersey, in a modern Orthodox community. Schools that I've been to include Torah Academy, Yeshiva University, Yeshivat HaKotel. I was very much raised within that world.
Yeah.
I would say most of my high school experience onwards, I was aware of there being something somewhere in me that enjoyed spending time with other boys. Nothing I would really put any words to. Uh, and I dated women, some long term. And there was a lot of me that thought, okay, that part of me is there, but it's not something I have to actually deal with.
Can I just ask, when you dated women,
hmm
what was it like? In other words, are you feeling like this is nice, but it sort of feels like friendship? Are you feeling? I guess what I'm trying to understand, because I'm sort of sitting here on the outside, is your feelings of sexuality. That it's something that is um, changing, or it's something that actually didn't change. It's just you who recognized it later. If you see what I'm saying. In other words, I'm asking, when you bring out with women, are you attracted to them and then that changes, or in retrospect you see you really weren't ever? How did that work for you?
Well, of course, different people have different stories. I would say for me, uh, most of my personal life up until 23, 24, let's say, it's hard to really define it because it was so undefined. Right in our community, we don't really talk about sexuality so much. We all had classes in high school and yeshiva where we would talk about relationships. And the main thing that we would say is that relationships are about building a home, building a home which is Jewish and holy, and finding someone who you could respect and fall in love with. And there were more than one woman who I dated where I felt that with them. There was a real sense of kinship and warmth and support and love. What was there beyond that? Was there the basic foundation which would make for a long-term stable home? It's hard to say because these were things that weren't really talked about, weren't really thought about, weren't really examined.
Are you saying then that the whole erotic element in a way gets merged or blurry with the fact that eros in general in Orthodox communities is kind of, this is not something we want you to think about so much?
It's not something we want you to think about so much yet. Right? We certainly have built into our community a way to bring erotic love into the relationship. And even, when we learn about it academically in yeshiva, we understand it's a part of it. But it has a place, and that place is for after you're engaged and as you enter into the marriage process. And we have a lot of space for erotic love, but we leave it on a respectful level between the couple and their rabbinic advisor. I think that place is appropriate, right? I think that there is a certain level of modesty, which is certainly fine. The issue comes up with people like me, let's say, where you turn 23, and you turn around and you realize, wait, the system which was supposed to happen doesn't seem to be applying to me. And that's where the questions arise.
So you're dating women, but then obviously there must be a point where in consciousness you're thinking something else about yourself, or how is that happening?
So at 23, three things happened at once.
Okay.
Okay, the first thing was I realized my dream and I made Aliyah and I moved to Israel. And for the first time in my life, there was never any future me to push the problems onto. Right? I could always think, okay, this is something which is there, maybe this is an issue, maybe things aren't clicking like I hear with my friends, but whatever, that's future Ben's problem. And all of a sudden the future is now, right? I'm living in a place and I'm making decisions which have a weight of much longer term.
Mm-hmm.
The second thing that happened was that when I moved here, I also started a clinical psychology program over at the Hebrew University. And while they never push you to go into therapy when you're studying psychology, most people get the hint that maybe it's a little bit helpful to learn what it's like sitting in the other chair.
Right.
So for the first time in my life, I was in therapy, not for anything in particular, but the ground rules are you don't not talk about things. Everything is on the table.
Okay.
And the third thing that happened was someone who was a good friend of mine, who himself was very part of his religious community. He was a gabbai in his shul and everything like that. Was also out of the closet and gay. We were part of the same circle of friends in Jerusalem, and he was moving to Tel Aviv. And I remember this moment where we were having goodbye drinks. And I thought to myself, what if this moment was a date? Now that's silly, right? You're allowed to have beer with another gay man or just a friend, and it's not a date. But I thought to myself, what if?
You played with it. You fantasized it. Yeah.
And then I started thinking, what if people would see me while I'm on a date? And my answer to both of those was that I'd be okay with it. And for me, that's when kind of that house of cards fell down.
Yeah, that's a big moment.
Yeah, because all of a sudden, I became aware of this being something that I'm interested in at all. I became aware of the fact that this area of my life, which I've never, ever talked about, right, something which has been partitioned far to the side, not only does it have a place, but a place that I'm kind of okay with. And so it meant that this is something that I need to start talking about in therapy. It's things that I need to start thinking about long term. And pretty quickly, I came to the conclusion that while being a Orthodox gay man is a more difficult and complex and subtle experience, for me, it's my best chance at happiness.
Do you feel that moving to Israel in some ways liberated you in that sense, in the sense that you leave your home behind, you leave the kind of entrenchment of everybody knowing you as a certain kind of person and coming here? Do you feel that gave you just a touch of freedom?
You know, it's interesting because people ask that pretty often when I tell my story. And maybe that's true for some people. For me, it was the polar opposite.
Oh.
I'm close with my family. We're all very supportive of each other. I come from a background where come as you are, we're happy to have you. You know, tensions arise around the Passover Seder. Fine, we deal with it. So for me, it was actually very difficult going through this process of, let's say, about a year, right? My first time, let's say, going to a Friday night dinner with other Orthodox gay men. And I'm thinking about it a month beforehand. Then I go and I'm thinking about it a month after. I'm speaking with my mom, and she asked me what I'm doing for Shabbat, and I say, oh, I'm just going to friends. It was hard for me, and I think it was very hard for my family, that there was a point of time where we weren't being open with each other.
When did that change? When were you completely upfront about it?
So I would say my coming out process probably took about a year.
When you were 23 or?
Between 23 and 24. I'm already advancing in my psychology training. I'm getting more and more involved in the advocacy world in terms of LGBT work within the Orthodox community. And along with that, I started talking to my close circle of friends about it. They were all but one incredibly supportive. Actually, the first friend who I told, she said yay and started applauding and then paused and wondered why she did that. It was
that is interesting.
Yeah.
Meaning that she herself didn't realize that she internally held those attitudes?
That I think it was a real sense, it was a trust fall for most of my close circle of friends, and my close circle of friends really, by and large, succeeded. That I was opening up about something that I was vulnerable about. I didn't really know where I was going with it. And lo and behold, they were happy to hear it. They were happy to hold it. Most of them were happy to accept it. And even the ones who weren't happy to accept it were happy to still remain in that relationship and work through it.
That must have been very gratifying.
And exhausting.
Yeah.
But mostly gratifying.
I mean, you, both in your personal and professional life, must have heard quite opposite kinds of stories where people are not quite so supportive and in fact create disappointment.
Sure. I mean, when I'm doing work with schools or clinics or something like that, I'll tell my story openly, and I'll also emphasize that anyone who tells their story needs to also acknowledge that they're just one person with one story.
Right.
There's a whole range. I mean, everything from parents who will come over to me and talk to me about their children and say, am I being supportive enough? To parents who kick their kids out of the apartment that night. There's a whole range.
Wow.
And one of the things which I found actually is that as I told more and more of my friends, there's a lot of parallels in our Orthodox community, even if it's not about sexuality. I start finding out about friends who have histories of mental illness that they're not talking about, fertility issues that they're not talking about, generally not feeling like they're in sync with their Orthodox community, and they're not talking about it. I have found that half of our community, at least, maybe all of us, we have our own closets. Some of us are talking about it, and some of us aren't.
And with your parents, was there a talk, a moment, or did this occur over time? Or
oh, I mean, you know, when I only go back to visit America once or twice a year, it means as much fun as it is to be on vacation. You know, that Pesach I had a job to do. Ain't no way around it.
So the first Pesach back was when you spoke to your parents.
Oh, one after the other after the other. I mean, listen, it was at times difficult, at times exhilarating. It is a complicated process for a lot of families because when you come out to your friends, they're there for you. When you come out to your family, you have to be there for them. Right? You have a whole lifetime where you've been working through that process. Your parents, your family, especially your parents, they have your lifetime of thoughts and dreams and expectations where even if they don't have a problem with where you're going to end up, there were certain dreams that got shattered. And they got to make some serious turns very quickly. So that part of it was difficult. It was a good thing that I was in America for a few weeks in order to be with them for the first reaction and the second reaction and the third reaction. And I would say by the following Pesach, we were all not just in a good place, in an actively great place.
What's happening with you Jewishly at this point?
I mean...
I'm saying, in other words, you go to these you live in Teaneck, New Jersey, and you go to these traditional sort of places of Jewish learning, including into yeshiva. You're transitioning in one way, and I'm assuming you're also transitioning in other ways in terms of your thoughts about God and thoughts about Judaism and law and religion and community and so on. What was that piece like?
I remember during a period where I wasn't yet sure, I was already sure of myself, I wasn't sure what to do. Maybe I started speaking to some of my friends, maybe not, I don't remember, but I remember going to the Kotel Friday nights, after Friday night dinner, so I'd only get there, let's say 10:30, 11, really at night, no one was there. And I would sit down with a book of Tehillim, and I would take an empty chair and put it next to me, and I would invite God to sit next to me. Because the overwhelming feeling that I got was, I know who I am, I know that I'm okay, and I also know that I believe. And I'm holding both of these things at the same time. And I'm looking around, and I'm seeing some of it comes from the text, some of it comes from our community's reading of the text. My original plan of a wife, 5, 6 kids, Victorian house, picket fence, dog, working in my community, maybe the ideals would remain, but it wouldn't look that way. It would be harder. And I remember at the time, I wasn't angry because of any halachic issues. I was angry because I felt like God put me in a position where I don't have options. And so that was my first struggle, right? Just seeing what my options would be, what my place would be.
Did you feel at that point that it was kind of binary? Like if I'm like this, then there's no place for me here? You did.
I felt profoundly alone. It was a brief period, but that's exactly what it was. Listen, I was a kid in the 90s, a teenager in the aughts. My knowledge of what homosexuality looks like was more or less Ellen coming out of the closet and then getting kicked off the air. Even I understood later at the time there was the movie Trembling Before God, which was making a lot of ripples in a lot of communities. From what I recall, it was only talked about in hushed tones when children weren't in the room.
Mm-hmm.
They would maybe have a screening in shul, and children were not allowed. So I grew up never having a name for myself. Right? The internet was there, but it wasn't as everywhere as it is now. So when I was sitting there and I was thinking, okay, I'm religious and I'm also gay, that meant that there is nobody else like me in this world. I think it was that profound loneliness which was the most difficult. Now already pretty quickly, the situation doesn't look like that anymore for the new generation of young gays.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, in addition to the fact that anybody who watches television these days knows that people like that exist and can be happy, even people who want to remain religious, we're all learning how to talk about it in a way which is much more open and much more responsible. So that basic issue isn't there as much anymore. The question of what are my options, that's something that I get once a week.
But let's go back to you then.
Sure.
Before we go forward. So you're feeling profoundly alone, and you put God in a chair next to you. Did God speak to you at that point? Did you speak to God?
Yeah, so I'm sitting there and I'm praying. I would say this was a process of every other Friday night for probably about 3 months. At a certain point, I felt the strong sense that there's an answer. And I don't know that answer. But there is.
Meaning, hypothetically, you felt there must be a way out of this bind.
I felt that holding both of those facts about myself is paradoxical, but not necessarily absurd. Whatever the answer actually is, I didn't know then, and I still don't know now. Okay, it's a big question. I'm sure, to be honest, a lot of the rabbis that you're speaking with, sitting in this chair, have a lot of the same questions. But I think that there is space to move towards an answer and to understand an answer. And for where I'm at now, that's enough for me. Now, if you ask me where I'm at right now religiously, to be honest, in a state of transition. There's a lot of traditionally Orthodox spaces that I enter into, and I don't necessarily feel so comfortable anymore.
What's the source of the discomfort?
I know this sounds silly out of context.
Well,
there are few places I feel more gay than when I'm in shul.
Huh.
I walk around, I go to work, I'm Ben, the person who is a researcher. I walk down the street, I'm Ben, a citizen of Jerusalem. I walk into shul, an Orthodox shul, and I'm sitting in the men's section, and there will always be the thought in my head, are they going to find out about me? Are they going to kick me out? Those are the spaces where it's sitting on me the most.
So there you're Ben the gay guy.
Yeah. And even if everybody says they don't care, the question is always going to be there. So I find myself looking more actively for spaces which are much more liberal than how I grew up. And in large part because it's mostly in those spaces, I could put that down, right? That I could take that part of my identity and it's still there and it's not going anywhere, but it doesn't have to be sitting on my head.
Is the feeling in the Orthodox space, I'll ask you a little more difficult question, really coming from the other, or is it projection actually, like you are imputing on them that they're seeing you this way as if you're lit up with neon, but maybe they're not?
Listen, column A, column B, right? You talk to me as a psychologist and I'll be more than happy to tell you that thoughts are not necessarily rational, but they're still real. And I know for a fact that most of the places that I go to, including the places that I've been raised in, they're more than happy to have me there as an individual citizen and a member of the congregation. They'll count me for a minyan. Most of the places will have me for an aliyah. That's something which is more and more accepted. But, and at this point I'm not just talking about my own experience, I'm thinking about a lot of friends, we're all waiting for the day that the community looks at me and says too much. Okay, I'm planning on living my life. Right now I'm single. So they're all right with that. What if I walk in with a potential boyfriend and we're not even sitting next to each other? Is that something the community will be okay with? What if we get married, right? And we want to register as a married couple to everything. Will my synagogue register me that way? let's say I want to have children. Will they allow the two of us to stand on the bima and hold our child for Brit Milah? This isn't a halachic question. This is a communal question.
Mm-hmm.
And the feeling that I get, and I've heard from a lot of my friends, is that even if we know that you're fine with me now, all these other steps that Orthodox Jews take to become more legitimate, those are the steps that will make me less legitimate. And that's hard, even at this early stage.
Right. It's a painful irony, right, to think that the things you're moving towards that in some level are more normative in every other context are for you the thing that will create more and more separation.
You know, it's fascinating. I've had more than one conversation, especially with rabbis, but not only, where they said, I don't get it. Why are you all so obsessed with marriage? Why are you all so obsessed with kids? Why are you making these fights? And my answer, and I'm not trying to be offensive in any way, it's because I was raised that way.
Yes.
You know, to me, I do think that my life is living exactly according to the ideals with which I was raised.
Right.
But those ideals look different. And okay, that invites resistance, and it invites important conversations to be had. But I have found that the majority of time, most of our ideals are alike. It's the practice where we have real legitimate differences.
Right. I agree with you. There's something very odd to me about this. Just to give you some context. So when I was going to graduate school in the 80s in Toronto, I knew a number of people in my class and friends, colleagues who were gay, and it was a time of AIDS, to be frank. Mm-hmm. I had classmates who died, classmates who lived a certain kind of life, and I'm not here to stand in judgment of anyone, but what was very striking was the amount of unsafe sex and a certain amount of, I had people who would speak to me and say, yeah, no, I'm not wearing a condom. It was very risk-taking, multiple partners. Flash forward, right? You see where gay people are actually trying to move to a more domesticated model in a way of long-term commitment, love, monogamy, and safety. And it's astounding to me the ire that this evokes when I'm recalling a time when actually this is exactly what you need to move to live a healthy, fulfilled, safe life, as opposed to, in other words, I always think, so what's your binary then? You mean they should be living like that, like my friends who died of AIDS and had unprotected sex and did not believe in commitment and so on, right? So I guess I'm wondering, I'm asking you, like, how do you account for this? Because it seems so un-Jewish in a way, right? I understand the sort of concerns about homosexuality per se, but what I don't understand is if you're already conceding that this person is gay, wouldn't you want them to live that kind of life? Can you account for that, for the opposition on that ground?
Well, I think your question has a few things to unpack. Right. The first thing is that there is a strongly perceived feeling, which I think is justified, that there's a culture clash here. Right. That the queer community was built in a place of disapproval from the religious establishment. So historically, the queer community comes from a place of not just being secular, but secularism. Because that's where they needed to be in order to exist. And so seeing one of your students come out of the closet as gay and having the feeling of, I'm okay with you being gay, but I don't want you to be part of gay culture. There's a lot of that which is legitimate insofar as you offer an alternative. I'll say the second thing about it, that a lot of the unsafe practices that you talked about is something that even internally, the gay community especially, deals with. You know, there at this point is boundless research, which is going into the question of why are people who are otherwise competent doing things which hurt themselves?
Yeah.
And I think the answer isn't just for fun. You know, regarding the question of why is there higher rates of depression, anxiety, hurting yourself, substance use and abuse, unsafe sexual practice, suicidal ideation attempts, and actual enactment, these are a lot of real questions, and for the most part, it's not because you're wrong because you're gay, it's that you're gay and you're marginalized, and you're at a higher risk because you're part of a marginalized community. Which again leads to the same conclusion, right? That if I'm worried about your personal health, then again, the best response to that is to make you as unmarginalized as possible.
Exactly.
Because people who are less desperate do less desperate things. Which then leads us to the bottom line of what you asked, right? Why is it that when there is already a movement within the community of moving politically more to the right, culturally more conservative, trying to be more in touch with family values, is there this opposition? You ask different people and you get different answers. You ask me, I think it's because we became too attached to form and not enough to, we became too attached,
To form?
If you ask me, it's because we became too attached to form and not enough to function. Okay, the form of the man, woman, 2.5 children is what we see as being the ideal home. But I want to go back to exactly what I learned, which is a house is built on more than just who's in it. A house is built on being faithful to each other, on trying to build a home which is, in its way, holy, trying to bring life into it, trying to be part of your community. And yes, the people who are in it and their physical intimacy is a part of it, but it's one part of the greater event itself. You know, the bigger irony of it, which you didn't mention, is that a lot of times you'll hear people trying to suggest that gay men and straight women, gay men and lesbians, you know, where one or both the couples are homosexual, marry people of the opposite sex. And to me, nothing is more of a parody of how I was raised than that suggestion.
I mean, in a sexless marriage.
Or potentially an open marriage, where those kinds of things also exist. You know, and
so a gay man marries a lesbian, and they don't have sex together, but they pursue...
Maybe they have children, maybe they agree that it's open within certain limits, which again, if it's two consenting adults, it's fine, for real. The question is, first of all, how consenting were they going into a story like this? How informed were they going into this? And again, what are we really suggesting when we talk about putting a couple together and we say this is a success story, knowing that they're not going to love each other the way that regular heterosexual couples do?
I'm just wondering if at the end of the line it's about legitimation. Like, if we had concede that you can be like us and you can have marriages like us and homes and kids and all that, then the lines between us kind of get thinner, they evaporate, and certain kinds of Jewish thinking very much need to see the kind of us-them binary in place, encouraged, I think, by Jewish tradition, which is often very binary about these things going back to Genesis and beyond. I'm wondering if that is part of it, that actually it's the normalcy which is so threatening. Because if this is now normal, then I don't know what normal is, kind of thing. Do you think that's a piece of it?
Listen, binaries aren't bad, right? We were raised in the world of definitions, especially in the Orthodox community. And there are certain people, especially people as part of the queer community, who feel very uncomfortable within binaries.
Yes.
And I acknowledge that, and that does lead to a question which I think is even bigger than the kinds of questions that I pose. Along with that, I think a lot of the time, we get very distracted by what should be, that we forget to talk about what is. Because we have facts on the ground, okay? Whether you want to talk about, 3% of the population, 10% of the population, we're talking about anywhere from 1 in every classroom to 1 in every million. So we know that we have these people and they're part of our community in numbers. So if we want to talk a lot about what we should do and what the Jewish ideal is, I think that's great and that's important. I'm coming as someone who's living my own life, an educator and a psychologist, and trying to put the reality on the table and trying to say, guys, this is what's happening. We have these people in our community, they want to live their lives, and whether you say yes or no, they're going to keep living their lives, hopefully. So now what do we do with that? I think that from when I look around at many of my peers, they're starting to make their own traditional couples, even if it doesn't look very traditional. Some people will call their ceremonies weddings. Some of them will call them commitment ceremonies. Some of them will have a chuppah. Some of them won't. The new traditions are already being made now. When they're having children, if it's a boy, it's self-evident that he's going to get a brit milah. So how do you do the ceremony? How do you find a mohel who's okay with it? These kinds of things are already happening. Right? The more I think that we can listen to the people who are already doing it, then at least we have an initial paradigm, which we can choose to accept or reject.
Right. You talked a little bit about education, like that's one of your hats, really, right? You have an educational hat here in Israel. You are instrumental in the organization Shoval. And I'm wondering if you can talk a little about the educational work that you do.
So Shoval is an organization. It's an acronym for Shakol Bara Lichvodo, all was made in his honor. And for the most part, that's our approach. Okay, that there's a series of basic things which most of us can agree on. That we were all made in God's image, that we're all loved by God, even at times when we're pretty angry with him, and that it's better for our kids to be alive than not alive. This is a relatively low bar.
Yes.
But the truth is, until we start actually talking about it and providing some basic training for how to ensure these things, we're not doing it. Okay, I could tell you schools that some of them we've gone into and some of them we've only heard about, where someone comes out of the closet to their teacher and they see their teacher's eyes glaze over. And they're no longer talking to the kid. They're talking to the phenomenon.
Yeah.
They're talking to the headlines. They're talking to the think pieces. And Nepach, you know, we're talking about a high schooler in a very vulnerable place who's coming and asking for counsel.
Yeah.
And very defined political or halachic responses have their place, but not right now. And most of our teachers know that, but for whatever reason in this place, they need to be reminded.
So when you go into schools, are you talking to kids? Are you talking to teachers? Are you talking to both?
So we have about 50 sessions that we do per year. I've been on the board for about 3 years. We have a roster of about 50 volunteers who have gone through a pretty rigorous training in order to be able to tell their story and facilitate the dialogue which follows. I would say about 10 to 15 of our sessions are parlor meetings in pretty strongly religious places. I mean, you know, we're talking about most of the yeshuvim in the Gush, into Shiloh, the religious parts of Modi'in.
What's that like? I'm trying to find the right metaphor. Is it the lion's den? Is it more comfortable than that? Like, what do you feel when you're going in there?
Usually, terror beforehand and relief afterwards. Consistently, when we run a parlor meeting, the greatest predictor of how many people show up is the size of the parlor room. Okay, we are consistently turning people away because they want to come and they want to hear and they want to discuss.
Wow.
And I think a lot of times what we found in a lot of these communities that we went into is that, I don't know enough to say majority, minority, what have you, but there's core groups of people in our community, of parents, of professionals, of teachers, of therapists, that are not comfortable with the current party lines, but they also think that they're all alone. And all of a sudden, for them to come into a group with a lot of other people from their own community who are all asking the same kinds of questions that they are, it's incredibly invigorating for all of us.
Yeah, it's very moving. Yeah.
And we're rarely, by the way, pushing our way into anywhere. At this point, we're invited. We're invited by parents who think it's important to talk about. We're invited by counselors in schools who think that this needs to be talked about. I would say we run probably somewhere around 20 sessions with schools, just about exclusively only with the teachers. And little by little, they're even starting to invite us to speak to their students. We never push for that. They think it's important.
Do you feel the tipping point there is actually the fact that more and more parents and more administrators are realizing that I have a gay child in my family, in my classroom, and so that, in a way, those facts are speaking louder than any kind of ideology?
For parents, certainly. Some of the greatest advocates in our community by now aren't queer religious people, it's their parents who want them to be able to come home for Shabbat,
Right.
who want to be able to see their grandkids more often. That's a phenomenon which really over the past year we've been seeing a lot more. I think more and more administrators and teachers who on one hand are terrified of what parents will say if they invite us in. On the other hand, they realize that if they don't deal with these questions, they're driving without a seatbelt. It's not a question of if, it's a question of when. And you have kids coming out of the closet and fires are started and danger lights are going off and parents are calling and teachers don't know how to deal with it. The administrator ends up in a tricky position. The kid ends up in a very tricky position. And I think a lot of times in these conversations we forget that our teachers are fantastic and they're good and they want to responsibly deal with things, even though things are a little more difficult to deal with.
Yeah.
So our way of dealing with it is that we send in 2 trained volunteers, a man and a woman, not necessarily cisgender, so sometimes they'll be transgender. A lot of times we'll speak with the school beforehand and see what they're comfortable with hearing. They'll come in, they'll each tell their story. That's all. No political agenda, no halachic agenda. They'll just say who they are. And then they'll just lead a discussion for an hour where people who have questions can raise those questions. People who have real issues with it can raise those issues. And the point is, they'll go through that process with us and not with the kid who's going to come out with them.
One of the questions I'm sure you must get asked all the time is about the verse, right? When you're asked that, right, the verse being Vayikra Yodchet Chafbet, right, Leviticus 18:22, which talks about what seems to be anal penetration between men being a death penalty offense and a toeva, an abomination. What did you do when you, I guess I'm asking, were you aware of that verse when you were transitioning? Was it bothersome to you? How did you negotiate it? How did you interpret it? How do you think about it now?
Well, I'll say, fortunately, I didn't have so much to transition, right? All I did was just come out of the class and tell people who I really am. So there was very little actual changing that I felt like happened for me.
Okay.
I think you're right that there were a lot of repercussions which follow talking about it out loud. I'll say that there's a whole spectrum of ways that people respond to that question. What's more legitimate, what's less? That's not my business.
For you?
For me, I think it's a private matter, and that's how I was raised. Right? And this isn't me avoiding the question. It's that I look at that law as my nida. And much like with nida, it's a question which is left to the couple and their rabbinic advisor. Now, I know plenty of heterosexual couples who say that we try and follow as much as we can. That's something we don't follow.
The laws of nida.
Yeah. And I know plenty of secular homosexual couples who say they prefer not to engage in anal sex because they don't want to. Okay, I think a lot of times people assume that to announce that you're gay also means to announce that you are necessarily taking part in anal sex. And I gotta say, a lot of AIDS research, which is very interested in men who have sex with men, shows that that's not the case. So we can separate a particular act from an identity if we'd like to. And beyond that, in my personal life, again, I answer the same way that I hear my straight couples answer when you ask them if they keep nida. We know the halachot. It was important for us to learn it. And we'll leave that question with our rabbi.
Right. So it's a private affair.
Yeah.
And
I understand that a lot of times that comes off as evasive. Ain't no way around it. But I think that's the way that I was raised and the only answer that I can give.
Sure. Do you see the verse as representative or as exhaustive? Meaning, do you see it as the gateway to prohibiting all gay sex, or do you see it as this and this only?
First of all, katonti. I'm not a rabbi.
Right.
I'm not a scholar.
Sure.
And it's very important that it's made abundantly clear that any answers that I would give are purely personal.
Sure.
And I'm talking, again, about what is versus what should. In terms of my reading of it, I don't see a workable answer that doesn't interpret it as specifically and limited as possible. I think that some people choose to read it as a sign that they should be celibate and that's how they should live their life. I think that's great. There's a lot of people who themselves are asexual, and regardless of what the Bible says, they're not interested in any kind of long-term companionship. Great. If people choose to accept that on themselves, that's fine. To impose it on other people, I think is cruelty. So to me, I think the only workable option is for us to say, this is a specific halacha. We read it as minorly as possible. We treat it the same way as nida, where we keep it as specific to what it itself says. We draw clear lines. And then beyond that, the pasuk doesn't talk about your identity. The pasuk doesn't talk about your ability to be in a couple or raise a family. It certainly doesn't talk about lesbian couples. And to me, I think that's the only workable solution, certainly for my life.
Would you say that your thought process here is also grounded in the way you think about God? In other words, to play this out would be to say God certainly would not condemn people to a kind of loveless life where they cannot express themselves erotically. And therefore, I'm compelled to look at this verse as kind of contained within itself and not a gateway to a completely celibate life.
Listen, it has to be a way which is able to give you peace. It's a Torah Chaim. It's explained to a way that people live. If the only options that we give people are ones which are profoundly untenable and at times psychologically dangerous, in my opinion, we need to look at it twice and wonder if that's the correct interpretation. And I'm not saying this as a way of take it and let's faff around and we'll find what works for people and go from there. I'm saying this with all the seriousness that's intended for it.
Meaning that you're starting from a principle of how you feel God interacts with the world and then applying it to the way texts read.
If I genuinely believed that the only options that the Torah gave me were ones where I would end up being profoundly alone and miserable, it would fundamentally change the way that I look at Judaism. The way that I look at Judaism and the way that I look at my relationship with God does not allow for that eventuality. I don't see a Judaism that ends with me being miserable, without options, just because of that. And again, to me, and the way I was raised, I want couplehood. I want a family. I would be miserable without it. So I feel like my hands are tied. I feel like I need to read the text in a way which on one hand is honest to the text. I respect that it's unchanging and that's the way it was always intended, but at the same time is grounded in reality.
And do you feel those can be reconciled?
Yes. Right now, by a lot of people, grassroots in practice. Someday by people who are much more learned than I in theory as well.
Thank you very much.
Sure thing.